Every talk I've ever seen him give, the conversations afterward are rich and long, but that puts us in the position now of having to move right on to our next speaker, Dana Pinto. In addition to facilitating our contact with Bartolo, for which I'm very grateful to have had him here. She is a member of our advisory board, for those who don't already know. She has written a lot about Jewish identity in Europe and more recently Israeli society. I'd like to welcome once again Dana Pinto.
I'm not a philosopher. I'm just a historian, and if historians were custodians of facts, life would be very easy. But one of the great things about the Einstein Forum is that one is allowed to come with what an essay means, an attempt, or thinking through unthought through concepts, testing them and wondering. And so when I, a few months ago, wrote down, must solidarity have an identity? I sort of knew what I wanted to say, but not really. And then, does solidarity have an identity? Should solidarity have an identity? And the three, I guess the answer, if you want to get a quick answer, would be, yes, it has an identity. Should it have? Can we hope that one day it may not? The answer is yes, it would be ideal. And I'm going to try to square these two things, both at a national understanding of solidarity and an international one. How's that for an ambition? So, yes, I'm afraid solidarity has an identity, and it's too bad that there are no invading Martians, and I'm now thinking, Dominic handled that, because the dread and the hope would have created a lot of possible notion of a global identity. But back to Earth, yes, the term solid means bound together with very solid, almost hard mineral ties. And it doesn't fit very well with our liquid, highly heterogeneous societies. Solidarity with different others who may not share our values, our understanding, who may not even like us, but who are now sometimes even citizens of our respective societies. Must they become like us in order to remove their otherness? This is one of the key questions, of course, of this unfolding century. I just would like to step back for a second in the past and bring you back to 1806 Paris under Napoleon with the Great Sanhedrin. One of the questions about figuring out how the Jews would enter society. One of the questions posed to them was, are you prepared to give up your community and to consider all Frenchmen as your brothers? Now, the answer was an unequivocal, intended or perhaps imposed, yes. History would show, unfortunately, that this yes was not accepted by all Frenchmen. But today, how many groups of people inside societies would say, yes, yes, I want to consider you as my brother if you come from another group, if you're perhaps a Muslim, if you're perhaps black, if you're whatever, if you're considered to be a non-other by many forces in a given country. I'm not sure today anyone could have that kind of an intended, imposed, positive yes. And so, how does one come out of it? We've spoken a lot about nature, and I'm afraid that nature doesn't set a good example of solidarity with others, not in the sense of going beyond fraternity. We all grew up with the reality that red and black ants kill each other, literally to the last one. We have learned that mice apparently feel empathy for the mice in their own species. Now we know, thanks to a German, whatever his specialty is, wood specialist, Peter Wohlleben, that trees help each other through an incredible network of roots and bring fluid sugar to the ailing tree with a problem. Of course, the trees are the same. And this has also created the notion of the wood wide web. But the Wood Wide Web has as a principle that you better have a bunch of similar trees together because one lonely tree in a forest isn't going to get any help. The third physical comparison is one that just came to me, and I'm still mulling over the effects. I happened to go to a 50th year reunion in Atlanta, Georgia of my high school, and there was someone there with whom he didn't really know what to talk about who said that he ran a magazine whose title I love. It's called Weeder's Digest, in terms of horticulture, how to get rid of the weeds, which I think is probably the most important thing a gardener worries about. It's like evil in the world, I suppose. But what was interesting, because I wanted to spark up the conversation, I said, well, you know, gardening, I always think of it as ethnic cleansing in the name of aesthetics. At which point, it was this moment of horror, and he looked at me very seriously. We were not clearly chit-chatting at that point. And he said, weeds are man-made. There are no weeds in the Amazon. And that got me thinking that it is because we do this wonderful ethnic cleansing that we produce this soil in which probably inferior little things of grass that wouldn't have a chance in nicely planted soils take over. And I'm still mulling the consequences of this conversation with the editor of Weeder's Digest, and I'm not going to put it into politics, but there's something there that has to be followed. And I will return to this weed issue about man-made weeds. Okay, so back to the human beings. Solidarity. Well, Kostek mentioned some great Arab philosopher. I will mention Jean-Marie Le Pen, speaking of great man, who once uttered a sentence that shocked everyone. I prefer my daughter to my nieces, my family to my friends to my neighbors to my countrymen, and my countrymen to the Europeans. He still considered the Europeans part of an understanding of a potential group of people with whom he had to make a dialogue. When his daughter ran for power, her top advisor spoke about the European flag as a torchon, which is what the kitchen, we use what to mop the floor, whatever it is. That was what he said quite recently. But even in more extreme circumstances, the elites here today were afraid and shocked, most of the elites, by this statement. This was made in 1984. But it makes perhaps some kind of sense. Yes, one prefers perhaps one closest to us rather than one furthest. And this may explain the neighborhood wars when others come in, even though they may live in a different type of building. And it can explain a lot about the horror of the London fire just recently. But even in the most extreme circumstances, solidarity is not exclusive and does not spread easily. We've mentioned, and I had already written about this fact, that in the Nazi concentration camps, of course, the communists ran their own show to protect their own because they had a teleology, and the others were just random Jews that didn't deserve to die for sure, but were not useful. And from there, I'd like to jump to another category, a historical moment, by saying that solidarity, as we understood it in the post-war period in Europe and perhaps even in America, was a kind of social democratic consensus that is gone. In other words, people shared politics, perhaps, but anyway, a social economic standard, and that it was a closed society. And it is no accident that Denmark became the first country in Europe to start having extreme right-wing, visible extreme right-wing parties, because it had the strongest of social democratic networks. Consequently, those who said, how can we have all these others coming in and cashing in while it took us 5, 6 generations of people of our own to produce this kind of wealth? So we're now living in a frayed social democracy, to put it mildly. We're also living among frayed solidarities. There are entire parts of people, groups inside our respective societies that don't feel they belong, they're not perceived to belong, so that this whole notion of solidarity or even fraternity is not doing well. But I'm giving you a very trite statement right now. Simply, there's an even added element here. The fear is not just that perhaps you can't die in the village with everyone, the way it was. I think one of the deepest fears of all of our societies is that the other can become us so easily. And in previous roundtables that I did organize on the future of the Respublica among different groups of people, I was struck, and I made a point of stressing, that if you're a Moroccan from Sweden or a Moroccan in France, it does not take long for them to become, in anthropological terms, Swedes or French. The body distance, the body motions, the expressions change and evolve very quickly. You cannot confuse a Moroccan from Sweden with a Moroccan from France. Consequently, what does this mean? That you really can become Swedish. It takes a little time. You've got to master the language for sure, but if you go to school, I mean, Zlatan Ibrahimovic speaks very good Swedish, besides playing good football. The point is, that's the hidden fear. The fraternity and the solidarity go because anybody can really become like us. They can even master the history. They can master the cues, the physical cues. They can learn to love whatever it is, and that is what hurts, in my opinion, most and scares people most. It's not having that different thing person down the road. It's an old Jewish story, actually. Anyway, this brings me, and here's a cut with no philosophical clarity, into the realm of international solidarity. We're fighting over national solidarity. But I would like to say that international solidarity is also identity-laden. It's also perhaps another way of asserting one's national identity elsewhere by helping others and perhaps even feeling good about it. It too has an identity. It too has its own ulterior motives. It too comes with a flag. Natural catastrophes are always seen as wonderful moments in which people come together and one can cite them all. There's always the earthquake that will bring in umpteen different national earthquake teams, each with his or her flag sewn on the left here on the jacket, to the point that sometimes they're stepping over each other as they're trying desperately to save some victims. We know some of them, the French doctors. On the longer term, it's British Oxfam. Well, Bill Gates stands on his own planet. But Sant'Egidio for Italy, and once upon a time, USAID in glorious terms. Now, what does it mean to be flying these flags while digging out survivors? Is it a way of putting a new flag in a kind of almost colonial sense, but done in the name of international solidarity? How many people then remain to take care of the wounded after the earthquake, of the psyches that will take forever to rebuild? That's another story. There are other earthquakes, there are other emergencies to come. Without wanting to be skeptical, Israelis are quite often on the earthquake scene. They have managed earthquake finding technology that goes with all the startups that Israel is famous for. But it's also a very important way of going to places where people do not like Israel, do not want to see it, may not even have relations with it, but are allowed to bring it in. So that would be one way of presenting a flag to show that it exists. And it was striking to see that in the Israeli case, when there were huge fires in northern Israel in the Carmel, there was such emotion that the Turks would actually bring in helicopters, just as there was so much emotion that the Greeks would help the Turks or the Turks the Greeks beyond these lines. So there are moments of feel-good moments. The Chinese themselves, perhaps the last imperialists on earth right now, build roads that are useful for their raw materials in Africa, but they happen at times to converge with the needs of the Africans themselves. Not always, because it's not always a rational highway scheme in terms of African needs, but they do help in a country with fewer and fewer roads where the old colonial roads have grown weeds. Back again to that metaphor. Now, even in France, you have hijab-wearing young women who feed the homeless. Wonderful. But sometimes they're part of Muslim charities that are not so much willing to help in terms of a non-identity solidarity, rather as to prove that Islam is the way forward, and what the Christian churches have not done or anyone else, they are doing. And there's an element of we can hopefully convert, or anyway make a claim. It's a two-way sword. I'm not saying that the young women who are feeding the homeless are not doing noble and wonderful things, but some of the people who send them out there may have more than one motive in mind. Now, what is the opposite of this solidarity with identity? It's the most pitiful one, alas. It's the United Nations flag with peacekeepers going around, X, Y, or Z. We don't really even know who they are most of the time. Are they coming from which country? And they're there. And without going to the extremity of the United Nations position in the tragedy of Srebrenica, on a daily basis, there is no emotion there. Maybe they're paid and they need to be in these United Nations task-keeping forces. But this is not solidarity without an identity. It's supposed to be a solidarity with the ultimate non-national identity. And I'm afraid it doesn't work. Or if it works, it has as many perverse effects as it has positive effects. And it's done a lot of harm to the notion that solidarity should not come with a flag. Also, solidarity, and I won't go into this, has become a big NGO, multi-million-dollar business, vital. Without the French doctors, I don't know what would have happened to the Ebola crisis. They were the only ones who were able to stymie it. And the WHO is far behind in terms of impact compared to the Bill Gates Foundation. So here we have, again, build constructions that were meant to be non-national that somehow have lost the high road to smaller, let's put it this way, national carrying flags, because Médecins Sans Frontières, it's called still the French doctors, and Bill Gates may be on a planet of his own, but he's still the American super millionaire. Now, how can one, and this is where it's really an attempt on my part, how can one unite the internal lack of solidarity today with the international perverse effects of solidarity at that level? And I'm going to throw out something that's really an attempt for me because I'm going in a direction which has never been mine. And what I'm talking about, I guess, would be an ecological solidarity. Now, mind you, I recycle bottles, I do the right things with the French garbage. The Parisians are only getting there. I mean, the Germans are like 100 years ahead, but it doesn't matter. The point is that I think, among the things that have to be done now, is to rethink ecological thinking from A to Z. It's not that I'm against current ecological things, but ecology is the shape of the planet, the situation, and somewhere there's a much of an effort to say that man is an enemy of the ecological process, an inconvenient presence, shall we say. When I was taking the metro in Paris during the COP21 conference, I was struck by, the French government must have paid for these ads, I suppose, entire metro wall, literally from one end to the other at the Concorde station, which is a pretty crucial station, were covered with beautiful Amazonian forest, and the simple line underneath, nature does not need man, man needs nature. Now, either because I'm Jewish or because I'm a humanist, and probably both, but this whole notion of this world in which man, I don't want to say a triumphant man, I'm not talking about, the Haydn Four Seasons, but I really would like to, in a sense, say, well, man is here. Maybe he came from a comet that brought in the nucleic acids. But how can you have this nature of, man, nature doesn't need man, man needs nature? There's a dialectic there that I think most ecological movements have to take into account without seeing man as always the ultimate culprit of everything. This requires a kind of intellectual shift. If one can understand and assume ecology can perhaps play this role of a non-national, international, global force that you wouldn't have then, the French ecological team going off to some place to plant trees, or the German ecological team going off to do some other type of energy. Why do I think perhaps ecology, in a re-understood sense, could play this role? Because I've seen, and I think it's true in Germany, but it's also true at the local level, that many of the ones that are not considered to be part of the Solidarity Compact, neither the fraternal or even the one of solidarity, are really attracted. Let's take some Muslims who feel really out of the compact. They're very attracted to parties, social movements, and identities which can be green. And not because it's the green of Islam, it's the green of ecology. And why are they doing this? Because they want to belong, and they feel they can belong on those counts because there's no religious, political, in terms of political history, covenant that must be signed to become citizens with an awareness of the wider environment. And I think one can play on this. Not play on this, I should not, excuse me, this is a really bad word I'm using. One should use it and fructify it, not play on it, excuse me, I really didn't want to say that. Now, these are important to bring together people who otherwise might not speak to each other, actively corroborate on something, and who can enter a new social contract on bases that are not necessarily flag-driven. Now, I would say that this particular idea of a rethought ecological movement stands also for the international system. For me, because it affects the rich north, which may become poor if it freezes over, the poor south, which can become rich if it doesn't freeze over, and all the notions of the refugees. In other words, if we can imagine a place, and I don't want to be idealistic, up in the sky kind of thing, in which one can really think of a human ecology that is implanted in the green ecology together, perhaps one can resolve some of the issues of solidarity and fraternity that we've been playing with and toying with for these few days together. Yes, when you saw the horror that we saw yesterday, how can you not imagine that there has to be a kind of rethinking of both the refugee issue, the belonging of the minorities who are not accepted, the situation in the ecological terms, and how to fuse them together. In other words, keep in those countries those who wish to stay by making them ecologically perhaps viable, allowing others to come, and why not, with all sorts of ways of entering the society, even to study and to go back, and opening up a discourse that goes beyond our small, completely withered and hackneyed terms of, international solidarity, European solidarity, blah, 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 solidarity. And one thing that did seem to me interesting, and I go back to the Reader's Digest moment in my life, like a month ago, is the following. If weeds are allowed to grow because there's just nothing there, and make this strange comparison with civil societies, what we're living with in terms of the refugees who make it to Lampedusa is a long trek through man-made destroyed societies where weeds could take over because there wasn't enough of that kind of lush Amazonian civil society, excuse me for being so metaphorical and scandalously yucky in a philosophical ambiance. But anyway, why is the horror so terrible on the way to Lampedusa? Because human weeds have taken over. Why is the scandal of those who are making all this money by putting people on boats who destroy them? Because there is no civil society. It's gone, lost in the deserts of Libya, in the deserts further south, and we haven't done much to help that, which means to grow the kinds of plants that can give sustenance both to the human beings and to the overall political context. And the comparison, I think, with those who were running away from Syria and even further from Afghanistan is though, and I will not make the value judgment as to what the European Union did with the pact with the devil with Turkey, but Turkey has a civil society. Maybe it's been torn to pieces. But those refugees in Turkey, they have been welcomed because there are sufficient plants there to allow the weeds not to exist. On the Lampedusa trek, it's all weeds. And so why another element that I would like to just suggest or bring forth with you, and then you will have the ability to carry it further, is that in this challenge of the refugee crisis, which is beyond borders, so all those flags are not necessary, and beyond pious words, there is something else that has struck me. First of all, ecology has become political in America now, thanks to Mr. Trump's decision to leave COP21. Now, whether was it due because Macron's handshake was just as tough as his, the Washington Post apparently seemed to think so at a certain point. So that it's not become, or, when I was speaking to Misha and realizing that some of the civil science, civil society attempts are ecological in Russia. So that in these huge, vast countries that once upon a time took ill compared, ecology might be playing more of a role today than, okay, I do recycle my bottles and, kind of thing. And leave me alone, I don't like these green people. One could imagine, perhaps, a green corps, like the Peace Corps of times, a green corps that would work. No flags, please. Just go with your little green uniform if you need one. Not the Russian greens that are in Ukraine, by the way. Give it another color. Rainbow is taken. White? I don't know, whatever. The point is that I was interested to see that great critics of Western development and white man's guilt have turned into the ecological element. And for instance, on the American front, Ta-Nehisi Coates ends about the dreamers with ecological pages to the effect of these dreamers are now going to plunder not just the black bodies, but the earth, and everyone has to work together, which means it's almost like an extended hand. White people who descended from these dreamers, come along, we've now got a new battle. More interesting, perhaps, was the just written book by the Indian novelist Amitav Ghosh called The Great Derangement, which to my fascination, and here again it's sort of implicit imperialism, when I was in London 2 weeks ago, they couldn't find it really, and when they did find it, it came from Penguin India, not Penguin London or New York, which having known intellectuals in India who say, yes, but I only get to be published by Penguin India, although it's a huge continent, there's still this feeling of, I'm not really in the real Penguin. So anyway, Amitav Ghosh's catastrophism, saying that humanity has always been in a catastrophic mode, except for the last 2 centuries when the bourgeois Enlightenment let it up on the notion of this foolish idea of progress, and he's trying to bring back to life Mahatma Gandhi. But what fascinates me is that for him, the ecology issue is not just about capitalism, it's about imperialism. And the pages he devotes to what happened to India and why India could not industrialize properly, and how things were taken out of India and destroying even the ecological movements are some of the most fascinating pages I have read at the junction between literature and political reflection. You could say, well, he's just a novelist, but I don't buy that. And the comparison he makes between coal versus oil, for me, was truly enlightening, because coal was human intensive. You could strike as a coal miner. You could do all sorts of horrible things to the established order as coal miner. And therefore, by the turn of the 20th century, societies fearing this trade union movement and the revolutionary started pushing oil, because oil is just pipelines. It's very unlabor intensive. You need a few technicians carrying the wells, and then the thing flows, and you don't have a working class anymore. Now, of course, I will not enter into the parenthesis of what happens to oil in war-stricken countries. That's another dimension. But certainly his position was that, the ecological answer to the imperialistic capitalist layers on top in parts of the world that are not our white Western world is something to ponder and to feel. At least I thought that this was quite interesting. Now, what am I saying about, yes, you can have there is something that would just, without being a materialist, people have written that the great Syrian tragedy began with a drought in 2009, 2010. The consequences were 2011. And then man entered and played Deus ex machina, or rather not Deus, Lucifer ex machina on that particular situation. But that there are going to be, and this is just a piece of what the future will bring us in terms of the connection. Of course, we all know the French Revolution would not have really moved along if there hadn't been famine in the countryside. But the issue is that we have to start thinking about these things, not in purely ecological terms, not in national terms, not in an understanding of power blocks. And it's a very big challenge. It's a ridiculous challenge I'm throwing about local solutions, which is certainly what can be seen in many of the issues, really local, hiked up to the much larger one. Protect nature, yes, but avoid the Fukushima's of idiocy of technology. You need water, so you put a plant exactly where you should not have, because the ancients had put milestones on top saying, do not build lower than this. Or the ranas in terms of industry. What does this mean? Solidarity perhaps is not a flag. Maybe we shouldn't buy pants that are cost 10 pounds. Maybe we should make a point of saying we won't. We shouldn't do this, we shouldn't do that. I'm not in the business of this. But I would like to say simply, no waste dumping, okay? We have the computers, and we have to recycle them. We're not sending them off in labeling parts to India and dirtying up and messing up that human society. What could imagine about this kind of solidarity? It doesn't sound ecologically boring, but it should become part of a wider political network. And perhaps in doing this, we will be able to integrate our others inside our own countries, be they long-standing others or recently arrived others. And I will end with just one little element I had sort of put in as an intuition in my little blurb, something about the Greek tragedy, that we were falling apart on that. And it's true, there seemed to be everything fraying from those 3 ironclad laws of the unities. And so I'm going to end with a kind of planetary tragedy. And what are the 3 unities? Unity of time for decades to come, unity of place, the earth, and unity of action to be hoped.
Start with questions right away. Stephen first.
Thank you, Diana. That was great. Could you just elaborate a little on this fear of being imitated? Because what is the fear? The fear is that your identity is fragile, it can be copied, it's not really yours. I mean, that was such an interesting point. That's just a question of elaboration. And then, with your idea of solidarity without flags, how did you react to Dr. Bartolo saying, I'm proud to be Italian?
Okay, should I answer this or take
You
some
can
more?
answer, yeah.
Okay, well, I think that hidden in the fear of the others is this notion that it takes very little for another, yes, to become like oneself. And that sort of spells itself out. We're sitting on this major universal transformation of migrations. Let me be a historian, it's very short. And we start seeing the beginnings of intermarriages, which in a sense are going to transform the issue of us against them. And in the process, what is amazing is that in the intermarriages, the children born out of that, I'm not putting aside, the terrorists, of course, which are an infinite minuscule minority, is that there is a what is transmitted are the values of that country. And anyone fearing the values of the country haven't studied the importance of Roman law after the Germanic invasions. And if one could only remember that stayed put, then there might be greater self-confidence in terms of the long-standing ability of national context to integrate. They will not integrate into Europe. You may say this is in complete contradiction with what I've said about having solidarity without a flag. And I think the two can coexist if solidarity is understood in global terms. Now, how do I react to Signore Bartolo? Well, given the fact that Italian flag waving isn't exactly the strongest of imperialisms, given the fact that Italy is part of the soft underbelly of Europe, and that it is right after Greece as the last student in the class, saying I'm proud of Italy, I think, is a valid statement in terms of humanism. If it's not, and if it doesn't match the 3% necessary things of the bank in Frankfurt, so be it. So I don't take his nationalism as anything more than, well, he's proud of the Metternich, Italy is a geographic expression. So it's an expression of the geographic expression in a wider world. Maybe Italy should reconquer Libya. That could be. That might be something worthy of pursuit.
Kostek.
Just to follow.
Oh, no microphone.
Just to follow up on what you said about Italy, I think that when Bartolo said, I'm proud to be Italian, he said exactly the same thing as I would say when I say, I'm ashamed to be Polish. It says strictly nothing to do with flag waving and everything, I think, with what we're trying to grasp. That is, what can we identify with? And I found fascinating your concept of green solidarity, because what you're really trying to do is reinvent the single cause movement. And solidarity, the trade union, was so successful precisely because it was single cause, and it could unite extremely diverse people around one simple proposal: the Reds out. But not only it was effective in that sense, it actually allowed us to rediscover that we've got things in common beyond that which divides us. And the weirdest thing was that the only movement that remotely resembled it then was the Western anti-missile movement, which culturally and politically was the opposite of solidarity. I tried to mediate between the two, and I remember the mutual horror with which the two movements reacted when they saw how similar they are. Because on everything else, we were like light years away, right? Except for the fact that we're very similar. Oh yes, in the fact of being a single cause movement.
Yeah, one was entirely financed by the Soviet Union using people.
Well, we turned out to be financed by the CIA.
Oh,
Thank you, CIA. For once, your taxpayer money went for good use.
I don't think
This is, I think, an added value of what you propose as single cause, and that I'd be curious to see if this is something you'd like to develop. And then, of course, your metaphor of gardening as ethnic cleansing, this comes from Bauman.
Oh, does it? I'm sorry, I didn't realize that.
Humanity and the Holocaust, when he says that the génocidaire is just like a gardener. He
I didn't
has
read that
nothing against the weeds. He's acting in the name of a greater interest, which is the beauty of the garden, or the beauty of society. But I'm very curious if you think that there is an added value to single cause by forcing people who see each other as different to recognize that we have things in common.
I don't think it's a single cause movement, so I'm not, from that point of view, if I were to build on this sort of understanding of the ecological movement, it touches every aspect of society. I think when I said rethink the ecological movement is precisely to remove it from the single cause, and I think one of the reasons why the green parties are not doing well, even including in Germany today, is that many of their tenets have been taken on by other more standard political parties. But for me, this attempt to go beyond the flag waving is, there's tragedy around the corner. I mean, major human tragedy on this. And if we think we're scared in the West by 158,000 people going through Lampedusa, wait when you see the desertification of half of Africa. And they're going to go north. They're not going to go to the very luscious, rich, Rwanda-like places in the lake districts of Africa. They're going to still want to come to us. So it's not a single cause movement. That's the only, maybe I'm being Pollyannish about it. For me, it is a global understanding of how you unite all parts of the world in what could be not a, you don't need a dictator to do this, but in some kind of intelligent planning. But I'm being an idealist here, but I'm throwing out an idea as a way of bringing people together who would not otherwise have been brought together against what, made solidarity become so important. Here, there is no clear enemy, and it's not the kind of passionate, warm, fraternal solidarity. It's fraternity. It's more of a cooler solidarity. Maybe the word cooler is precisely what we're looking for in this case. That has to be built into everything, from medicine to whatever. So it's not single cause for me. It's a multi-cause attitude. And it would require intelligent political, economic, social planners who can speak beyond the immediate needs, if one can find them.
Susan, you wanted to comment directly on that? Yeah. I'm jumping in front of Alexander for a second. So.
Just a follow-up to that, because I also didn't understand you to be turning this into a single cause question. And I was really interested by your claim that I'd never thought about before, that the switch to from coal to oil is is a way of decimating possible labor unions and just doing without workers, basically.
Yeah, that's Gauche's claim. Of course, I hadn't thought of it either.
Okay, whoever's claim it was, we can't all read everything. It's a good point. And I just wondered if you had any specific ideas. I mean, you said it would infect everything and involve every cause. But I was thinking about Naomi Klein's argument, this changes everything, and whether there's a specific I suppose, critique of capitalism. I mean, I'm not asking you, it would be totally unfair. And I like your saying that the Onset Forum is a place to try out ideas that aren't finished yet. We do think of it that way. I just wonder what direction you would want to go in economically, given that I think notions of growth and so-called growth and are so intimately tied up with this set of questions.
Well, I'll just give you one idea, but these are answers that have not been thought through, so please take them as literally at face value. Because okay, let's consider this a brainstorming. I'm trying to imagine what kind of transformation societies would have if you had independent power levels, almost in a Danish sense. What would happen in terms of then bringing in different groups in a what I would call horizontal development, rather than having some big, electricity company dictate things from below? And I know what I'm talking about since I live in France, 82% nuclear energy. So that from that sense, what happens if you start then having communities that actually are self-sufficient in terms of producing energy with recyclable things? I think that will transform the whole notion of even democratic setting. And I think there might be something there that could be one of the beginnings. The Denmark case perhaps stands out to mind, but it has to be done almost from a grassroots level up. That's one element. Then I was thinking of a second one, but now it escapes me for the second. So allow me to bring it back if I can retrieve it.
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead. No, I'm still thinking. Go ahead. I can answer another question. I'm sure we'll come back.
We'll come back. Okay.
Yes.
Alexander, can we have the microphone? You have it.
I very much like the idea of matching solidarity and ecology, and I think there's something very available in there, and it made me think of a non-anthropocentric ecology, and that made me think of Bruno Latour's suggestion that maybe we are caught in unfruitful subject-object distinctions, and we should rather look at things we considered objects as being subjects, as actors that interact with us, including algorithms, including the Ozonloch, up to the point where we could say we are also our computers, our forests, and our forests and our computers are us. So where does this traditional distinction come from? How helpful is it if you want to have a holistic ecological argument? And if you go that way, you have a very interesting, at least vision, strong poetry, about an available solidarity that extends the whole debate, the anthropocentric debate that solidarity is between us, and how do we actually get to a further universal dimension, if you want that.
I remembered my second example, which was not a green one, but was the symbol of what can be done is if you think of India with no landlines but cell phones everywhere, which connect everyone, including the Indian village, to those who have to work in Saudi Arabia, and what that kind of, very supple change that can make. And you can imagine it both with electric grids or, recycling or reusing. But again, on the issue of maybe perhaps bringing the whole world together, yes, but I still remain a humanist at heart, in the sense that the rights of stones don't move me much. They don't move much either, but they don't move me much. And the deep ecology that has been presented at some point is so anti-humanistic that this is why, for me, it's new even thinking in green terms. This is the first time in my life I've done it, because I had always been sort of, a bit not feeling at ease with that whole movement, even though I think perhaps vegans will have to rule at some point, preferably after my death, in quantities that become humanly, and no one can eat the kind of beef Americans eat and assume the planet will go on. So from that point of view, I understand. But it does require the green people, the green movement, to become a bit more humanistic than it has been. Just as I think, you know, creators have to become a bit more green.
Jennifer Stolman.
Yeah. So I must confess, as someone who does people work, when people drag or schlep their recycling bin, it seemed to be a very middle-class white movement. And I'm one of those who schlep their recycling bin. But this is quite useful to apply into the American South. First and foremost, your comment about the flag, because of course we're fighting about the flag. Mississippi still has the Confederate emblem, so we take down the flag. And what I think is particularly useful, because I used to think that environmentalists and ecologists were just avoiding people in the problems between people. But I can see how you could create solidarity with even the poorest people in the Mississippi Delta and bypass the existing small but powerful white good old boys, right, by creating, and this is something that can bypass the sort of racial etiquette that I was talking about. So I have no question except write the book, please. Because I would really like to, this I could bring home to black and white communities in the American South and say this is a pathway to solidarity. So thank you. I must say, I just used to say, oh, environmentalists, we have real things to do,
Yeah.
right? And now you've completely blown me away. Thank you very much.
Wow.
Appreciate you. Because that's something we can take down. I can really take and use, and both poor blacks and poor whites can utilize and get on board without the friction of race necessarily.
Oh, great. Wow, if it could work, fantastic.
So write the book.
Well, can't I just tell you about it?
Okay, tell me.
Philip Kitcher.
Well, I want to applaud what you said in your paper, but I want to applaud also something you just said, which is, I think, that the business about stones and the deep ecology movement. It seems to me, and I've tried this out on generations of students, there is no coherent ethical position that gets us beyond sentience, it seems to me. Nothing, and so it has to be, I think, a humanistic outreach to the sentient world ecology movement. So let me just say that as a preliminary, but I want to go back to Susan's question. So what socio-economic arrangements do you propose? That question seems to me to set a trap. And the trap is to go back to thinking in terms of our standard approaches to economics and the economic relations to politics and other social issues. And I think, I have to say this, that the economists that I know are wonderful, creative, intelligent people, but this is a very primitive science. And the best we can do in this area seems to me pragmatic experimentation. And the nice thing about what you're proposing is, of course, that there can be all these local and diverse attempts to remodel many kinds of things, including our economic arrangements. But the trouble with all of this, and this is where I think there's a problem that comes back to bite, that the kind of experimentation that's needed to develop the ecological movement successfully in these local ways involves experimentations that are bound to have human costs. And that requires already kind of protections built in for the experimenters. And those protections already presuppose a kind of solidarity that we don't yet have. So if we encourage particular groups of people, either across national borders or within currently existing countries, to carry out their ecological, social, economic experiments, to try to find out what works and what will work in time to do the kinds of things that we need, then we need already a pre-existing framework that will allow, as it were, the successful ones to bail the unsuccessful ones out when things go wrong. And so this is not, I mean, I could put this as, you know, a nasty, vicious dilemma. You can't get it off the ground, but I don't want to see it that way. I want to see it as something more of a spiral, that we get little bits of solidarity that can lead us to little bits of experimentation with sort of protections already built in, out of which can then come further relations of solidarity and further, more wide-ranging. That's what I would hope. So you ended on a note of hope, and I think that's the best way for hope going forward. But you know, I think you're pointing towards something that's deep and important, and that the economic question is really a very hard one, and there are all sorts of dangers, I think, therefore, in amplifying what you've done.
Yeah, could you give me one example of what you're talking about? Because all these traditional industries are falling apart already anyway, so it's not that you're going to take all the coal miners and make them plant flowers or something.
No. So there are, I mean, so there are going to have to be, I mean, since there's going to be disruption of the labor market involved in this, there are going to have to be programs of job retraining. And we know that countries have differed in those, and that some work very much better than others. But there are also just simply these kinds of, I mean, nations are going to, I mean, one of the proposals that's been made with respect to carbon taxes and so forth is that there will have to be climate clubs. That is, groups that, as it were, form an agreement that they will abide by similar rules. And we don't know, I mean, if you have a carbon tax within a group, we don't know in advance whether the appropriate way economically to go forward with that is to use it to invest in public goods, or whether, as Hansen and other people have suggested, Jeff Sachs have suggested, to see this in terms of a dividend which differentially goes back to the poorer people. So that's a highly as it were, non-regressive approach to this. Because if you simply use your carbon tax as a way of and distribute the reimbursement according to consumption, of course, that is regressive. So there are all sorts of ways of articulating a carbon tax, climate club set of rules. And I think no economist in the world can predict with any degree of probability exactly which of those are going to work and what the economic consequences of them are going to be. But if these things are going to be carried out, though, if those kinds of projects are going to be necessary. All of this is I'm sorry, terribly condensed, but it's complex and very difficult. And I think Susan's invitation was, as it were, to go back to the existing forms of economic arrangements we know. But perhaps those can be our starting points, but we've got to be prepared to be incredibly flexible with this.
By the way, I agree with you about that. It's just, it wasn't an invitation to go back. It was just saying there's this giant roadblock here.
Yeah.
And while it's nice that Exxon was in favor of the Paris Agreement,
A little bit.
Yeah. You know, there's the elephant in the room is capitalism, as far as I'm concerned. Yeah.
It's alternatives to
Capitalism.
capitalism.
Yeah.
Capitalism
Or-
is currently practiced.
Oh yeah, capitalism can also reinvent itself. It's quite good at that. So it can become very green, and in the process actually do things that are very positive. Because when I asked you, it was not a sort of, philosophical question. I couldn't come up because it shows how far away I am from the ecological world. I hadn't even thought of the carbon tax for half a second, because it seems to me almost like all those diplomats who've been trying to solve the Israeli-Palestinian issue. I mean, to me, it's just, they're talking about it. It seems false, badly based, and so I didn't even think about it, to tell you the truth. But of course, it's probably out there. But instead, if you sort of have these people who are getting finally their roofs are producing energy for themselves and money for them, then maybe because of, you know, whatever they're called, those photovoltaic things on the roofs, it just can create something else. And if you latch it onto a political project, which is, you know, share this or do this with your neighbors and recycle with your neighbors and keep the river clean, I was really thinking of a grassroots thing.
Yeah.
But the carbon tax, I can't understand, frankly. I'm sorry for my ignorance.
I know there are other questions. If it's any consolation, I'm also withholding my own right now. We really need to take, I think, a 10-minute break before we go on to Misha Gabovich's talk. But before we do that, I want to thank Diana Pinto very much.